Good morning. This is Michele Fallon. I will say a little bit about ourselves before we get started. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and my area of interest and most experience is in infant and early childhood mental health. My experience with adolescent parents has been primarily as a supervisor and reflective consultant for home visitors who are working with teens. I've raised teens, but so that's my primary experience, and here's Angie.
Good morning, Angie Klinefelter, and I am a parent educator for the St. Cloud School District in central Minnesota, and a huge part of that role is home visiting. It's an enhancement project that has a focus on families with some additional challenges. They qualify in terms of social emotional development delays, many of whom are teenagers over the years that I've worked with. In addition to that, I'm doing some work in central Minnesota as a project manager supporting social emotional health of families with children, and again, one of our target populations are teens. And I do have 2 teenagers currently in my home, and the third will be a teenager in July, so soon to be 3 teenagers in my home.
Living it, huh?
Every day.
All right. Well, let's get started. This is our plan for today. We're going to be talking about defining adolescence and its challenges. Angie's going to give us information, too, about the double whammy of adolescent parents and being an adolescent parent who have experienced ACEs, which is very often the case. Then talk about the competing developmental agendas of adolescents and their babies. Kind of some of the other things that are part of the big picture, such as engaging fathers and grandparents. And then we'll try to get into some strategies. And hopefully in the handouts you have the PowerPoint. There is a handout on adolescent developmental milestones, and that's related to the competing developmental agendas. Then there is the Working with Pregnant and Parenting Teens tip sheet and a Supporting Young Fathers handout from Healthy Teen Network. We wanted to include those because both of those have some nice resources on the back. So there you go. So this is a good news, bad news situation when we look at some of the statistics about adolescent pregnancy. So as you can see from this slide, the birth rates for adolescents 15 to 19 are declining, but still not at acceptable numbers. And this particular slide divides this by race and ethnicity. So that comes from the National Center for Health Statistics, just to kind of give a picture of what it is we're talking about here today. I think it's really important to define adolescence. And there's this author, Ronald Dahl, you can see the citation on the slide, has a wonderful article about this, and points out that how we can define, we have to distinguish between adolescents and teenagers, because if we define adolescence as he does, which is, quote, that awkward period between sexual maturation and the attainment of adult roles and responsibilities, then adolescence expands beyond teen years. It can start before kids are teens, and it can be a prolonged period beyond the teens, as many of us know. So we can define it as a period that begins with physical and biological changes to puberty, which ends in taking on adult roles. But the catch is that puberty is now beginning earlier. In the last 100 years, in females, it's more than the onset of puberty is occurring more than 2 years earlier than it did 100 years ago. And I think there are a lot of theories about that, including some of the hormones that are used in our food production and other things. But the point is that it gives us this paradox. So if the the period of adolescence is prolonged relative to what it was 100 years ago. It means that, so I'll just read this quote, the recent expansion of the adolescent period has also stretched out the interval between the onset of emotional and motivational changes activated by puberty and the completion of cognitive development, the maturation of self-regulatory capacities and skills that are continuing to develop long after puberty has occurred. So it's sort of a cruel joke in a way that kids are becoming sexually mature earlier when it only exaggerates the discrepancy between their sexual maturity and their cognitive and social emotional maturity.
You know, the piece that I think a lot about when I look at that end of that slide is that self-regulatory capacity. And so one of the things that we'll talk about later in more detail is that trauma-focused lens. And I think that is an interesting piece to consider in regulatory capacity. So if we have parents who have experienced excessive amounts of trauma, or ACEs, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that regulatory capacity is further compromised. So at times we might be dealing with an adolescent parent who feels like they're more maybe a 4-year-old capacity, maybe a 10-year-old. Sometimes it's parents that are beyond that extended time frame that we just talked about, those early 20s or maybe even 30s, where we sometimes feel as though we're talking with a teenager, and that is due to that social and emotional consequence of that trauma.
Wow. Well, if we talk about what do we know about adolescent parents, and keep in mind, like ACEs, these are statistics, and they're certainly not. This is certainly not true of all teens by any means. But we know that about 2/3 of adolescent parents live in poverty, and with public assistance, I thought this was an interesting statistic. Over half of the new MFIP cases in Minnesota started with a teen birth.
That is interesting.
Isn't it? So we might have a mom we might have the grandma who's in her 40s, but chances are that that she started out as a teen parent as well, requiring MFIP enrollment. Teen parents, and I'm saying teen parents because it's easier, but keep in mind we're really mindful of the fact that it isn't confined to the teenage years. So is that okay, Angie?
Yeah.
So again, teen parents, we're really talking adolescence, which can be before and after the teenage years. So they're more susceptible to depression, and we know that, I think, about teens in general as well, much less, you know, what Angie will be talking about when it's compounded by ACEs. Tend to be victims of neglect and or abuse and other adverse childhood experiences, as we've mentioned. Many adolescent parents are children of adolescent parents themselves. So this was the statistic I had from 2002. It would be interesting to have a more current one, but 36% of adolescent parents were also the children of adolescent parents. And this is an interesting one. This is a statistic from TeenWise Minnesota, which was formerly MOAP, Minnesota Organization for Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention and Parenting. I think they changed their name because that's quite a mouthful. But they have a good website. But to find that almost half of fathers of babies born to mothers between the ages of 15 and 17 years of age are themselves older than 20, which again makes us concerned about considering victimization and other related things. As parents, adolescent parents tend to be less sensitive and responsive to their infants' cues and needs for reasons that we will be talking about when we talk about adolescent brain development. They're less likely to talk with their babies, which we know is essential for babies to develop optimally in terms of their language and cognitive development. Adolescent parents also tend to be more authoritarian in parenting attitudes and disciplinary styles. And again, I think we can think about that in terms of the way they themselves were raised, given some of the risk factors that contribute to adolescent pregnancy, but also just from a developmental standpoint and their own pursuit of autonomy and so forth. They're much more likely to perceive their infant as difficult. Combining that with the fact they're likely to think that their baby or toddler is doing things intentionally. In other words, they're much more likely to take things personally that a baby or toddler does, which again makes sense from a developmental standpoint in terms of that sort of adolescent egocentric thinking.
You know, I think of a family that I was visiting for a couple of years. They are in a situation where the teen parent was living at home with mom or grandma and had some sisters involved that were also teenagers. So lots of teenagers in this household. And then this mom who herself was a teenage parent as well. So many of the things that we've just talked about kind of pulled this scenario together. And as I look at these, the slide and how these parents tend to be, many of these were true for her in very obvious ways. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that she loved about her having a baby was that she could dress her up. So this little girl had clothes that you can't even imagine. She should have been in a magazine, and she got lots of positive reinforcement for that, both in from the members of the household, but also from the providers that would come in, because you just couldn't ignore how cute this little girl was. So in some ways, it served a purpose to connect with this little girl. But the mom's purpose was there was something about this little girl that was almost like her doll. Like, I'm going to treat her like my doll. And so as long as she was good and looked cute, that was very important to mom. Whether they were going to Target, the grocery store, or wherever, this little girl needed to look cute, particularly when she came to school, which was interesting. But in other scenarios, if she would cry or be fussy, immediately that mom would have that perception of difficulty and taking that personally. And why are you doing this to me? And comments like that were consistent with what we see on the slide. Very much authoritarian to this little child who not only was special needs, but was very, very young, and there just isn't the capacity to be manipulative, of course, at that age. So, but this mom really perceived that as intentional behavior when she would fuss or cry, and it was interesting because in a loving way she would say things like, "Oh, you're so naughty," but she would hold her and smile at her while she said it. But the words were very, she felt attacked at times, I think, or perceived that as an attack, which was interesting to watch play out and try to increase her ability to see her baby in a different way was challenging.
And how old was this mom, Angie?
She would have been, when we started working with her, she was 16, and we worked through 18 with her. So yeah, just an interesting scenario. I can talk more about her later if it feels like a good spot to do so, but this slide just reminds me of her.
Well, slightly off topic, it does bring to mind how the challenge of being regulated for home visitors in the context of like I've experienced, some arousal just hearing that story in terms of what it's like to be the baby, but then also what it's like to be this mom. So I think that how we stay regulated in those moments is especially challenging in the context of adolescent parenting. So I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Juno. I love that movie. Not a typical adolescent parent. However, it is important to note that adolescent parents are not a homogeneous group, because this early sexual activity may, for example, in the case of Juno in the movie, represent a detour or derailment of otherwise healthy development. It's like legitimately an oops, and the adolescent is able to get themselves back on. They had a healthy trajectory developmentally to begin with, and they get themselves back on that trajectory after the birth of a child. It also, as we know, can reflect a broad spectrum of risk-taking behaviors. Again, risk-taking being a characteristic of adolescence in general, but certainly exacerbated by environmental and ACEs kinds of things. For some adolescents, it's actually a fairly adaptive strategy. I think adolescent girls who are parentified who tend to have a lot of caregiving responsibilities for siblings or for their parents are more vulnerable to becoming pregnant as a way to get out of the household or to get out of those responsibilities. If I'm going to be a mother, I might as well be a mother to my own child, kind of thing, which again may actually in that context be fairly adaptive. But pregnancy can also, for some adolescents, be an opportunity to, as we say, get their act together. That it is not, I mean, if any of you have worked with adolescents for whom chemical abuse is an issue, I've been aware of some adolescents who have really pulled themselves together in terms of substance abuse in the interest of their unborn child and their baby. So that's one example. But so it isn't, so adolescent pregnancy makes sense but it's in an individual context. What is the meaning of this pregnancy or this baby for this particular adolescent? Well, here we are. So I think, again, thinking about from an adolescent brain perspective, which is not known for necessarily sound reasoning at all times, for some, this baby will be someone who will love me. Which, as we know from the baby's perspective, is a burden that cannot be borne by a child. But certainly that kind of idealization of what me and my baby against the world can do. Sometimes it's a marker for adulthood that I'm going to be treated with the respect I deserve once I'm a mother. And there's often a lot of family cultural messages about that could be true. The downside is that, well, one thing that we know is having a baby as an adolescent, while I might believe it's going to be liberating, actually it's likely to make me more dependent on the very adults that I'm trying to liberate myself from. This idea that if I have my boyfriend's baby, he won't leave me, and how often that leads to real disappointment, and how is that going to impact the mother's ability to relate to her baby? What will become the meaning of the baby in the context of that kind of major abandonment or disappointment?
Well, and I think oftentimes those babies look like those dads. There's characteristics or there's traits. I've talked with a handful of moms even this year who have mentioned things like, we're in an abusive situation, the boyfriend or dad is no longer there, and there is this either a fear of the toddler who now hits me, who reminds me of that dad or that boyfriend, or this automatic negativity because just the face of this baby or toddler reminds that mom of that violence or that abuse. And so therefore, it's hard to connect in a relationship-based way that we know makes sense for babies that they need. And so as a practitioner, that's really difficult to watch because you can see the stress that puts upon that toddler, but also the stress in the mom. And so bridging that gap and helping that mom see that baby for that baby. And not
as an individual person
relationship. Yeah. So I do see that quite a bit.
That's a tough one. I think I was providing supervision for a program that involved teen moms and their babies attended this particular high-quality child care center where there was a family advocate who was actively involved with the parents. And this is a young woman who had her baby at 15 and actually did extremely well. By the time she was ready to graduate from high school, her son, who was 3, was absolutely solidly developmentally on track, doing really well, lovely relationship. And this mother had done well enough that she was given a full ride scholarship to a college and was going to be moving with her son down south to attend this college, and lo and behold became pregnant with her second child. And anyone who knew this mom well really believed that she was getting a lot of pressure from her family, kind of around who you think you are, that you're something special, that you think you need to go on to college, and that I think this second pregnancy was really, probably unconsciously, her attempt to stay close to her family and to avoid this really scary transition. And so her plans changed, and she did not, last I heard, go to college. And so but I think it was a strategy for her to stay close to her family. So let's back up a little bit and talk about just adolescence in general. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the book by Dave Walsh called Why Do They Think That Way? A Parent's Guide to the Teenage Brain. I highly recommend it because it really helps us understand so much more, and I wish I had knew this when my kids were teens. I did not, that there really is a sensitive period of brain development that occurs in that pre-adolescent period that makes young adolescents very much more vulnerable than we might have thought earlier, because literally there is this proliferation of synaptic development followed by the pruning. So we're talking about the use it or lose it kind of formation of brain development. And we used to, we know that most of the brain development is occurring in the first 3 years, but again, there are periods along the way, and adolescence and pre-adolescence being one of them, where there is this additional surge of brain development. So that's why we worry so much about chemical abuse with adolescents. Because their brains are literally more vulnerable during these periods. And then again, this mismatch between their biological maturity and their cognitive and emotional maturity, and how vulnerable that makes them.
I had the privilege of actually hearing David Walsh. I took a class from him shortly after that book was released at the University of Minnesota. And so I did not have teenagers at the time, but I was so thankful to be in the class because he talked about these pieces. In addition, he said, think about culturally how we view teenagers in the United States. So my daughter recently said to me, she's 17, so at the time she was 16, my son would have been 14, and the youngest was 11. And she said, so Mom, you have 2 teenagers in the house. And everywhere we go, people who ask you, oh, do you have kids? How old are your kids? And after you tell them how old they are, they say, oh, how's that going? Or, oh my gosh, how do you survive? Well, I have to laugh because I was thinking of this story, and as we walked up, we were discussing the presentation about teens, and there's this automatic reaction that we all have to, oh, you're working with teens, how do you ever do that? Or I can't even, so there's already this cultural struggle. And then many of us have yet to learn pieces about this brain development of teens. And when you put all of those things together, I can imagine, or I try to imagine, what does that look like through the eyes of the teenager?
Good point.
And what she said to me that day was so eye-opening, because she said, why does everybody think that we all suck? And I said, well, and she said, I'm actually happy at your responses, just so you know. But she said, you talk about, well, I've enjoyed it. I like watching them do this or that or whatever sports and activities they're in. But it is a conscious choice to say the positive about these folks. So now we're getting into a pregnancy on top of being a teenager, which is kind of a double whammy of sorts.
There's certainly a stigma.
There is. So I already suck, and now I'm pregnant. And now I have all these people involved in my life for home visitors, and automatically I know what you probably think of me or their perception of what we may think. So I think it's just helpful to keep that in mind.
That's a really good point.
They're not set up to be good at certain things because of the brain development, but they already know that society thinks that they're difficult. So just something that, it was eye-opening for me to have that conversation with her.
Wow. So this is just my attempt to insert a little humor, but if you'll notice that the love section of the brain in the adolescent, this cartoon of the adolescent brain is particularly large. But this study I just find fascinating. So if you work with teens, if you've had the phenomenon of, well, in my case is say, Mom, can I use the car tonight? No, I'm sorry, I need the car. Why are you always yelling at me? It's like, I didn't yell. But this shows we got science to explain this here. So this researcher at Yale was looking at using MRIs, compared adult and teen reactions to pictures of emotions. So these pictures are up on the screen and they're being monitored on MRI. And interestingly, young teens in particular, so less so for older teens, but young teens perform really poorly on a task requiring them to identify emotions, and partly because they're processing them in the reactive part of the brain. So the amygdala, which is where we, our internal screening for a threat, that's where their brain is actually processing these pictures of emotion, compared to older teens and adults, where the processing of emotions switches to the prefrontal cortex, where we do our complex thinking, we have more flexibility, we have that part of the brain is where we have our reflective functioning, our ability to take perspective of others. So literally from a brain perspective, if a younger adolescent is saying, why are you always yelling at me? That is truly may truly be their perception from a brain development standpoint. So now we're going to put a whole bunch of them in one building and call it a junior high or a high school and expect them to accurately read the emotions of each other and their teachers. So I think in some ways it can be reassuring too. Again, why are teens difficult? It's because it's a brain thing.
Kind of like the toddler period. We talk about toddlers are not set up to be successful when you look at all the developmental tasks. So if they're supposed to, give us some resistance to figure out how to be a little bit independent, now we apply these same pieces to teens. They really aren't set up to walk out and be successful in large groups of aged
of raging hormones.
Right. So I think just to give a little grace to that, because I think it can really stir things up in the adults that work with them, because there is this idea of respect, and I need you to follow these particular directions, and you're not doing that, and therefore you're bad. So I think we have to pay attention to biologically what's not working well for them, in addition to things we'll talk about in a few minutes with that life experience, depending on what that looks like for these.
Absolutely. And it raises the issue of, from a cultural standpoint, we don't have much in the way of ritual that acknowledges the transition from childhood to adulthood. Many other cultures, there's a more explicit honoring of that transition, and I can imagine that given what we're talking about, that could be a really useful thing and to celebrate that. So just an aside. But I think why it's important to know about the adolescent brain is it helps us understand the multiple paradoxes. So how is it that teens, by and large, are certainly not a high-risk health group from a disease standpoint, but we have high rates of morbidity related to, accidents and things related to poor judgment. And part of this is that we see, even though cognitively they're developing, a young teen who has functioned in a pretty capable way is suddenly appears to be more reckless or take more risks despite what seemed to be previously good judgment. So it can be very confusing for some of us as adults. And then what we talked about, just the biological maturity versus the cognitive and social emotional maturity that's needed for parenting. So how does this look in adolescence? They tend to be primarily focused on the present and have difficulty with the future, which means their capacity to anticipate consequences may be not what we might expect given their other skills. And how many adolescents really need to learn through trial and error? They want to learn by their own experience. Think of where we would be as a culture if all we had to do was convince the next generation of our experience. But it doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
Right.
But there's certainly, adolescents are of course motivated towards mastery, like, you know, we would hope. And that can be, you know, looking for success in things we would hope, like school and sports and so forth. But it also includes social successes with peers and wanting to tap that kind of drive for mastery when we're dealing with adolescent parents, and including successful parenting as a potential motivator for them.
I also wonder about that trial and error piece, particularly when we're home visiting families or parents that are teens, because if there's this trial and error happening and we can even identify it at a cognitive level, as a practitioner, how does that impact us? Because the trial and error in our mind is on that baby.
Exactly.
The baby is under trial and error process, which can make us as a home visitor feel a little bit crazy. And I think to note that in ourselves, that, okay, this is, how do I incorporate this into something that might be helpful, as opposed to just being busy about it. Because being busy about it gives us information about what we need to do to see this mom in a different, or dad in a different light. Because that can get tricky.
It sure can.
Because we know the cost of trial and error on infants. So I think
and babies can't wait. I mean,
babies can't wait.
Their development can't be put on hold waiting for the parent to mature.
Right.
So it is, again, it gets back to our task as home visitors and how arousing that can be, because we've got this double dose of protective urges going on.
Right.
So what's up with this egocentricity of teenagers? That I found this really helpful, that kind of self-absorption and that it's all about me kind of thinking is really part of identity formation. And again, we talk about toddlers and teens have very similar, if not identical, developmental agendas. So it's like, who am I in relation to family, peers, in the world, which is parallel to a toddler's discovery that they have a different mind than their parent. And then what are my values? And I need to figure that out. So, and that that striving for autonomy is part of maturity, but it's like what happens when toddlers learn to walk and suddenly they put themselves in much more danger, which requires parents to be much more vigilant and controlling, so to speak. And the same is true for adolescents. So it's just, again, it's that paradox that we deal with. And I love that, leave me alone, but always be there for me.
Yeah.
When I was parenting adolescents, one of my favorite books is by Roy, I think his name is Roy Wolf, and it's called Get Out of My Life, but First Will You Take Me and Cheryl to the Mall? And
Yes.
I highly recommend it, because that is the paradox.
Yes, that is a great example.
And by the way, we're going to take a 5-minute break at 9:25 or so. Forgot to mention that.
And also, before we get into the ACEs information, there was a comment that was sent in that says, sadly, TeenWise was closed in 2015.
I didn't know that.
So I was not aware of that either. So that is unfortunate.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So we'll have to figure out where those additional resources or helpful resources are.
I think they were a branch of the, and I think one of the handouts is from Healthy Teens America.
Okay.
So that is an active and really valuable website. And I'll look that up while you're talking to.
Appreciated that comment. That's always helpful to know. I think that's one of our struggles in the digital age, is that we've got lots of fabulous resources and then those change at a frequent rate as new ones come out as well. So before we get into the ACEs and adolescent pregnancy specific, most of you, I'm sure, have heard of the ACEs study, but I did want to just clarify for everybody from the Center of Disease Control and Prevention. They talk about adverse child experiences, what the ACEs stands for. Both positive and negative have tremendous impact on future violence, victimization, and perpetration, and lifelong health and opportunity. So as such, early experiences are important public health issues. much of the foundational research in this area has been referred to as this adverse childhood experience. And if that's something that you're not familiar with, it's a really helpful piece in the field that has really, I would say, pulled together a number of agencies that we've been trying to convince for a long time that these early experiences matter to our families, lifelong, long-term, and this particular study was linking these adverse experiences to the health consequences, which got the attention of those organizations, which was a really good thing. So when you look at the ACEs, I'm just going to read through the 10 ACEs that are talked about when this study was produced, so that you can hold those for a few minutes as we talk through how this reflects on our adolescent population. Emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence is on the list, household substance abuse, mental illness within the household is on the list as well, parental separation, divorce, criminal household member, emotional neglect, and physical neglect. So, you know, each individual listening can do that sort of quick assessment of those home visitors or home visit families that you work with to wonder or maybe know factually if those pieces have occurred. And if they have, thinking about this question, does adolescent pregnancy increase with ACE score? So the more of those experiences you've had, the higher your score. And this is important to think about, and this piece was actually taken from a larger presentation, as I understand, right, Michelle? Mm-hmm. Yep. So the ACEs has been done and looked at in many different ways, and this is a section of that. But is ACEs or adolescent pregnancy the principal source for elevated risk of long-term psychosocial consequences and fetal death? And then there's some pieces about the study and how that was set up at the San Diego clinic. It's important to take note, the slide that we looked at earlier from the national statistics and the different populations in which are experiencing adolescent pregnancy, and looking at this particular study, knowing that it was 77% white is just helpful to keep that in context.
And 72% had attended college.
Yes.
So this was not a high-risk sample from an economic standpoint.
Yeah. So what we'll look at next is this idea. Yeah, thank you. There's a strong dose-response link between the number of ACEs and adolescent pregnancy. And so when you look at that and think about, is there a low correlation between a number of ACEs and the struggles that our teens are having with pregnancy issues, or is that more on the high end? And what we know based on this particular study is what you see on your slide. When the family environment did not have ACEs, becoming pregnant as an adolescent did not raise the likelihood of long-term negative psychosocial consequences. So based on the previous slide, looking at this as a group of people that were potentially supported in some ways or had some resources in some ways, that was potentially a buffer for families who were experiencing teenage pregnancies with support. And so the ACEs talks a lot about, you know, that piece, the consequences of having those experiences, but also the buffers in which help this go well. And so you probably have families where you know that it's not going well, and you've probably met families where, well, what's the difference? How did this family survive this in a way that's helpful?
So that may be those adolescents that we talked about earlier that are on a healthy developmental trajectory to begin with. The pregnancy kind of takes them off track, but they're able to resume back on that healthy developmental trajectory. And so it isn't the pregnancy itself, it's the circumstances around the pregnancy, it sounds like.
Yes. So there's a family that I'm working with right now, and this just happened yesterday, so I'm still I'm personally processing this still. Her experience was in another country growing up, and she had lots and lots of good care, lots of sensitive, responsive care, up until the age of 8, and then things happened. Her dad brought her to the United States against the will of her mom, and ACEs, I would say, at that point in her time, multiplied. So she was at 8 years old, not in the early childhood experience, but 8 when this kind of turned a corner for her in a negative way. So she has been working through being a single mom, at the time of the birth of the baby being a teenage mom, and she has this really interesting inner resilience. And what I did not know about her until yesterday was that she had that sensitive care response mom until age 8. So the stories that I heard were much about her mom, but they were always in a negative light because it existed in the context of 8 years old and above. But I asked her some questions yesterday, and I'm not even sure why, but she alluded to the fact that her mom was, oh, I was the firstborn, I was the favorite, she tells me stories about this and that, she sends me pictures of us when I was a baby, and she was, and she just lit up when she was talking about it. So one of the things that we discovered together yesterday was that was the missing link. I kept asking her, where does all your resilience come from? Where does all of your, your health come from? And she has many challenges. There is no doubt that she has many challenges. But for those first 8 years, she had what she needed. So we made that link. We figured out that's the deal. And when
angels in the nursery.
Yes! And so I said, listen, you have had a chunk of what you need. No wonder you want to do this differently and you want to. And so I explained to her how that experience isn't a cognitive memory, but it's a part of who she is. And she said to me, I can't even believe that we figured this out.
Oh.
And she had tears in her eyes, but a big smile on her face. And she said, now I know I can do it.
Oh, wow. Andy.
And it was, I know, it just gives me goosebumps. As I said, I'm still processing it. But when I think about, she doesn't have that experience currently with her mom, but she had it for a period of time. And what a lovely recognition of that resilience. And I think we can offer that to families, regardless of where they're at in this process or the ACEs that they've experienced. I think we can offer that.
And how do you see that reflected in her relationship with her baby?
Because it happened yesterday, I will be interested to watch. But what I perceived was this incredible hope that I will be able to continue this. I always tell families, the hardest job you'll ever love is being a parent. So she can continue the hard work, but with confidence and an assurance that she has internally what it takes. Wow. And I got really excited, and sometimes I get really excited. Sometimes it's good and not so good, but I got really excited for her because I thought we found something that is going to carry you.
To hold on to.
Yeah, so I love that, and I think families, teenagers in particular, who have a history of ACEs, need someone to help them find that resilience.
Absolutely.
In that parallel process. So when we look at the number of ACEs and how it correlates with the percentages of pregnancies, 0 ACEs, 16%, all the way up to 7 or 8, 53%. So what this will tell us is a little bit of maybe common sense in some ways that, if we have these experiences, physical abuse, emotional abuse, family violence, whatever, we are at a higher risk for incidences of adolescent pregnancy for many reasons.
Right, and again, it would go back to that idea that for some of these kids for whom there are this many adverse childhood experiences, becoming pregnant and leaving a home may, in fact, be somewhat adaptive for them. I mean, so we have to respect that.
I pick it out. So we had briefly mentioned earlier this trauma and self-efficacy. So when we have a history of adverse childhood experience, this high-risk behavior in many categories, including sexual, may reflect growing up in an unpredictable environment in which random events and actions have no rational consequences over which she had any power or control. I think we know this. We know when kids grow up in chaotic environments, they are at a much higher risk to keep that level of chaos up, because that is what feels normal and that is what makes sense. I had a mom this week tell me, when I explained that piece to her, she said, that's so interesting because I do feel that way. If things are calm for 2 or 3 days, I go looking for something.
Which, when you think about typical adolescence, I mean, think about junior high, that I can go into absolute meltdown over my friend's breakup with her boyfriend. and that's typical adolescence. But add on what you're talking about here with the ACEs, it's just it's the overwhelming.
It is pretty overwhelming. Lots of cards stacked against.
Right. And I think this was helpful to me a while back in understanding. I mean, why wouldn't you use birth control? But if you have little or no sense of self-efficacy that I can do anything that's going to make any difference for me in the universe, it makes more sense why you don't use contraception, because you don't have that sense of I can take some control here. I can be master of my destiny. It feels just hopeless.
And I think that also considers the fact that a lot of these kids with adolescents with these ACEs also have the effect of depression.
Yeah.
Or anxiety. So not only do I don't feel that I have control, but I also don't have the ability to step outside of this depression and say, you know what, I'm going to make a smart choice and at least use contraception.
Right.
I really don't think that's a part of their experience. So the result is that deeply,
sorry.
Oh, you're good. That's okay. Where to go? The result is a deeply held belief that decisions, problem solving, and actions will not make a difference in the outcome. So one of the things that we tend to do, and this is sometimes just logistically based, is we leave the dads out. We struggle to engage those dads or fathers at some level. But it's helpful to see some of the pieces that affect our boys, our young adolescent boys, who are exposed to some of these ACEs. So when those boys have that exposure to abuse, domestic violence, they're more likely to engage in behaviors that put them at an increased risk for involvement in teen pregnancy, such as the substance abuse. Some of those things, again, those boys, because of the brain-based information coupled with those ACEs experience, put them at a much higher risk. Boys are less likely to report their victimization. Girls, I think girls, there's more and more avenues and opportunities for them to talk about that victimization, where the boys are still under a culture of suck it up. That's not okay, you can't talk about that, you can't feel about that. So they're at it. From that perspective, sometimes that producing a child is a way to reestablish a sense of masculinity. Like, I can actually do this, this makes me a man. It's sort of that no longer, it's that teetering of that adolescent, I want some control over things, and if I can produce this, then I am masculine. Unfortunately, some of these boys then will have that idea in mind with many women. And then that becomes sort of bragging rights of sorts that I can do this. Screening for trauma should be an important prevention strategy for all of our kiddos. And I think we're trying to figure out how to do that screening well, and it's in process.
And you know, a lot of this information came from a really nice paper called Boys Will Be Boys, and it's that Kahn and Pelusi reference on the slide. And that is available at the Healthy Teen Network, which is the national organization. And one of the things that jumped out at me is that sometimes boys who have been sexually abused are more likely to be involved in a young pregnancy. And again, back to this, it's part of a way to reestablish a sense of masculinity and take some control. So, you know, we have to be so thoughtful and mindful of our boys as well as our girls when it comes to these kinds of early onset sexual behaviors in teen pregnancy.
And I also think from a personal even perspective, when I do the home visits, I will say that it is a goal that I engage the teenage dads when they are available and present at the visit, but I will say it is not the easiest, most comfortable.
Right.
So the girls seem to be fine, but I notice within myself some anxiety about engaging those teenage dads. And yet, as soon as you engage them, they all of a sudden feel so important and have so much to say and have lots of information. fill you in on how can we better serve this family.
What do you think it's about, the anxiety around engaging the dads?
I think because of the limited experience. I think teenagers I've had experience with, both in my home and outside of that in my work, but it's primarily been female.
Mm-hmm.
Dads are a different story. I love working with dads. It's actually a population I really enjoy working with. But the fathers of that are teens, and part of it is many of the ones in my experience that I've seen have this sort of edge to them that I think is a little bit on purpose. You know, don't get into my space. This is a protective factor of mine. And I always talk myself through that, thinking you have a lot to say and you are valued. And so as soon as I get started, I feel much better. And I always think, how would I feel if I was a teenage boy and this woman, you know, 3 times my age is coming in here and saying, here's what to do with your baby.
Well, and I think they're also stigmatized in that we're much more, our protective urges are going to be much more easily aroused by these young women. And they're often perceived as the victims of the dads. And we know about the, quote, gatekeeping effect, particularly of maternal grandmothers who are angry and feeling protective of their daughters. But I think as a society in general, we really do marginalize these dads, and that's a big mistake because, well, we'll talk more about that later. How about if we take a 5-minute break? It's 9:25, so we're going to start up again at 9:30, but give us all 5 minutes to collect ourselves and do what we need to do. So we will be back. Okay, we're back. We want to just encourage you to write in questions in the question box. If anything comes to mind, or if there's a resource you want to share with the rest of us, that would be greatly appreciated. So don't hesitate, because we are keeping track of that as we go along. I want to just switch briefly to a kind of an overview of infant developmental needs, so we can contrast that with where adolescents are developmentally and think together about how do we resolve these competing developmental agendas. So we know that infants are completely dependent on caregivers for all basic needs, and that they need consistency and predictability and routine to learn to regulate. They have to have a regulating partner to learn regulation, and they also need that kind of predictable, nurturing relationship, so they have a sense that the world is a safe place to explore. And then, of course, they need these positive, good enough, optimal experiences that facilitate brain development. And so if kids need sensitive, responsive care, what does that mean? It means that their caregivers recognize their ability to signal needs. In other words, the baby is a baby, but they can tell me things, that they are communicating from the very beginning. And they need the caregiver to be able to accurately interpret those cues and signals, and then respond in a way that meets the need of the infant. And any of us who has parented an infant knows that that's an ongoing learning task. It is not always obvious. And of course, you know, infants thrive with consistency and predictability, because that's what creates, of course, the infant's inner working model of whether they're worthy of care, whether relationships can be trusted, and here's the big one again, self-efficacy. I can influence the universe on my own behalf, and whether the world is a safe place to explore. So we know these are sort of bottom line things that infants need for healthy, optimal development.
You know, do you wonder sometimes, Michelle, about a couple of those as it relates to that consistent and predictable scheduling? So I know a lot of providers who will talk either in reflective consultation or just with colleagues about if that parent would just get a bedtime, if that parent would just get a feeding time at the table. And so I think we know that that's a goal for sensitive responsive care, but we also have to look at that from a realistic perspective.
Absolutely.
And not make our what seems consistent and predictable for us be imposed upon that parent. And so we have to think about ways to do that and introduce that and talk about that without saying to the parent, just get them on a sleep schedule.
Right.
Because I do a lot of visits with colleagues. We co-visit for any number of reasons, and that is a stickler for a lot of people. Everybody's got their own feelings about what's the right thing to do around.
And we were talking off air about how do we measure our success, and you know, if it's to get an adolescent parent on a consistent, predictable schedule with this baby, we're likely to be disappointed. But it isn't an all or nothing kind of thing. That if we can do one small thing towards something, predictability or consistency, that is success. And we can think about this sometimes in terms of risk reduction with a very valid set of goals to have. So you're right, and I'm glad you brought that up, that what's best is not always what's realistic, but it doesn't mean that that's our only measure for successful outcomes. But here's what we know, that parenting responsibilities, if we think about those infant needs, that is pretty diametrically opposed to typical adolescent needs. And because if as an adolescent I'm trying to sort of define my sense of self in relation to the world, in relation to upcoming expectations for adulthood, to my peers, and to my, you know, with my family as I'm moving away from my family and more towards autonomy. Now imagine putting a baby in the picture, and all of that defining of self has to happen in relation to the infant. And then again, as we said, the adolescent brain and the adolescent developmental agenda, that it's all about me kind of thinking. And again, we think of that as a developmental / brain thing. Of course it impedes my ability as an adolescent parent to read my baby's cues. I may need to be taught that in a way that I wouldn't if I were 10 years older. Although again, when we consider ACEs and all that, it certainly complicates the picture. And this idea that my baby's out to get me, my baby's spoiled, my baby's just trying to get her way, I'm going to take that personally, and I'm going to show this baby who's boss because that's my developmental agenda, and how hard that is for us to watch as home visitors.
There's the baby or the family I mentioned earlier that loved to dress her little lady up almost like a doll. She had this experience. I think of her a lot when I read through these pieces, because she would say things like, I'm so mad at my mom, meaning grandma, the grandma in the situation, because she wouldn't watch the baby for a night. All I wanted to do was go out with my friends, and she would not watch the baby. And grandma would be in the room to say, well, I'm not watching the baby because the baby cries the whole time that she's gone. And the mom's response would be something like, well, that baby's just trying to get her way, and I should be able to leave once in a while. And so there was this interesting dynamic of grandma trying to hold the teenage parents responsible for, but not understanding how do we talk about this through the lens of the baby. Right. The mom saying, I need to go out with friends, this adolescent competing agenda, and the baby saying, where's my mom, when she goes out for long periods of time at night, where that's the baby's attachment. Her pattern and setup was that I sleep with the baby. And so this baby was saying, you can't be gone at night. That is not acceptable in terms of the mom's perception. And mom saying, no, 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 I get to go out. I get to do my thing. So that dynamic gets complicated.
It certainly does. And thinking from the grandma's perspective, you know, you made your bed, you lie in it.
I think she said those words.
I want you to be responsible, and yet we can't. That being a mother and being an adolescent, how do we honor both the needs that go with both of those roles. And I think that's when it gets really tricky. So I think, we've talked about this, just that, and as the example you're pointing out, that parenting an infant often, most of the time, results in actually increased dependence on the adults you're trying to liberate yourself from, which, is pretty tough on the developing adolescent. And then when we get into toddlerhood, that's where things, I think a lot of parents we work with in home visiting in general, but certainly adolescent parents, this notion that I can do marginally well with a baby, like the baby that can be dressed up like a doll. Yeah. But when that baby moves towards, becomes mobile and moves away from me, I may, depending on my experience that as abandonment. It certainly ups the ante in the baby's need for supervision and safety considerations, and that means anticipating consequences, which is not a teen strength. But then when the toddler challenges the parent by saying no, that feels very personal, and I'm going to show you who's boss, and we can understand, I think, the tendency for adolescent parents to be more harsh in their parenting because it does feel very personal. When that baby, when we know this is a toddler who's figuring out my mind is different than your mind, and we want to nurture that, but the teen's having the exact same dilemma, and how can then she be in the position, he or she be in a position to appreciate that as a toddler?
I often think for myself, the visuals are helpful. So when I go back to that brain piece about where's this parent sitting at this moment, and it's sort of in that, it's in that amygdala area that is so reactive. Mm-hmm. So they're not online with that prefrontal cortex to say, well, let's be reasonable about this. And so I think we forget that. Yeah. Because our first reaction is, wow, I'm watching this parent react to this little one, and I have concerns about that. And yet, imagining, where are you sitting in your brain right now? Mm-hmm. And you don't have the ability at this moment to be online for a number of reasons with the prefrontal cortex. So helping parents learn a little bit about those pieces, and that was one of David Walsh's recommendations, was, teach kids about this stuff.
Literally about their own brain function?
Teach them about their own brain function. Let them know what's happening, and let them know that, you know what, I'm not sure why you have a bad rap, because if you're developmentally set up to do these things, and kind of that seems to work at times with mm-hmm. teens, mm-hmm. to say, okay, so if we're set up this way, but we do have to parent. So what do you think is going to work? Mm-hmm. How do we do this?
Nice.
And they have lots of ideas, which is great. Then mm-hmm. it comes from within and not. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, us telling them isn't going to be helpful.
Right.
Please
dang it.
No. It's so much easier.
If they would just listen, I have so much to say.
That's right. That's right.
Well, and then here's the real irony. Adolescent babies need a regulating partner. Regulation develops only in the context of relationship. And infants are completely dependent on their caregivers for regulation. And adolescents are not exactly well known for their capacity to regulate. And so we've got this metaphor of the blind leading the blind. And again, I really liked your idea about even explaining that to an adolescent in terms of the brain functioning and how what the task is and why sometimes it's hard, and how the baby needs that. And then that this romantic notion teens may have about what it means to have a baby and be a family and maybe be a couple in partnership with a dad who may or may not be in a position to fulfill that dream. There's just a lot of challenges. But I bet everybody knew that already.
I think they probably did.
All
right. So when we consider some additional challenges in working with this particular population, the multi-generational ACEs family piece definitely plays a role. So we've got many situations where grandparents are involved because they need to be involved. From a basic needs resources perspective, a lot of these teens struggle to do it alone. So as much as they want to have that autonomy from that situation, they're stuck. So that's debilitating. But an additional struggle is that we also have grandparents who may have 5, 6, 7 ACEs themselves. And so they, although they have more maturity in terms of age and experience, they still have this struggle with their life experiences in terms of ACEs. So it's something we really have to note. And what's always interesting to me is when I'm visiting a family and the grandma has the experience of being a teenage pregnancy, as does this daughter, and how the grandmother, there's some wisdom in her experiences because this is her second time as a part of this teenage pregnancy experience. And often my personal experience has been that grandma is very powerful. They seem to be very powerful women in the context of, let me tell you what to do with that baby. So still very much treating that child who is now a parent.
Well, and as a grandmother myself, I think about, if I think I'm near the end of my own child-rearing experiences, particularly if I started as a very young parent, all of a sudden, it's not just my own dreams and plans as an older adult are being affected, but also the dreams I may have had for my daughter or son are being dramatically altered by this adolescent pregnancy. And so there is really, I think, often for grandparents, a grief and loss process that will affect the dynamics certainly as well.
Absolutely. And, this is inclusive of those fathers in terms of how do we get them to be engaged, particularly if they have experienced a number of ACEs themselves. We have a lot of fathers who are involved but may not come over for that home visit, whether the mom asks. Sometimes as practitioners, we forget to ask or invite that person to be present. And so I think just being aware of that is helpful. Collaborating with other professionals. This is probably one of the trickiest pieces because we know that some of these families that we're home visiting, we are not the only ones there. We sometimes have 4, 5, 6 agencies that are involved. And so if we're working on this good enough parenting and this responsive care, teaching these adolescents a little bit about their brains, all of these pieces that we feel will be important to connect with this teen parent. And the next person who comes in the next day or perhaps in that afternoon in the same day has a completely different agenda. How difficult that can be for us. And I really hesitate. My thought is that everybody has their particular agenda. And all of the agendas are important, but those compete. And I will never forget the day that I went to a home, and this mom who was probably, I would say she was about 21 in her parenting experience. Lots of domestic violence happening in their home. And she was under a number of stresses, had a number of ACEs, and we all sat around the room, and for whatever reason, we were all there at the same time, in different agencies, 6 professionals.
Oh my gosh.
And so we were kind of going around, and people were sharing what they thought, their results were. And many of us as home visitors have checklists or notes or whatever we keep, and so they're handing these notes to this mom, and here's the 3 things I need you to do for PT, here's the 3 things I need you to do for, whatever. And I just kept watching this mom, and I thought, she is about, it's like the blast off of the rocket. I'm thinking she's about 10 seconds away from kicking us all out of here. So I thought, I'm going to just try this and see what happens. So I said, okay, well, hold the phone here. We're going to stop for a minute. And everybody stopped. And this was very risky because I'm with my colleagues and professionals. And so I was actually feeling very anxious as well. But what I said to the group was, okay, we need to take a deep breath because I'm sensing, at least if this were me and you were all doing all this, I'm about 5 seconds from kicking you all out. And the mom looked over at all these people and she said, that is exactly right.
Oh, good
and
one.
I said, okay, we're on the right track. So I said, what I'm saying is, if all of us give her 3 tasks to complete at this point, her developmental state and age is in this adolescent period.
Mm-hmm.
And we're now telling her what to do. She's really sitting in her amygdala, right? I mean, you put all of this together, and we're this close to being done, all of us. So what she said, what I said was, hey, maybe we can just pare this down. Can everybody say one thing that they think might be reasonable? And then the room calmed down, and everybody gave her one thing. And then I sort of said, you know, and we know that things happen in a day's time, so you're going to do the best that you can. And we know that you're living, and we kind of did the support piece of we know how challenging this life is.
We get it.
You. And then she relaxed and maintained relationship, all of us, and it was such an eye-opening experience for me. And I thought, wow, how difficult this collaboration piece is.
Right.
And I think we have to pay attention to how difficult that is for us, but also these families are juggling. I've even asked families, how many people are in here? How is that? How do you like that? You like that? Is it good for, you know? And I get all kinds of responses, but it's complex. So I think just to note that, and adolescents may have more than others.
But you validated her and you promoted her self-efficacy. You gave her back some power. That's a lovely example.
It was. I was glad that it worked out because there's been times it hasn't. So that was one that I thought, okay.
Yeah. I just want to throw out a resource too that I was thinking of while you were talking, that called the Daddy Book, which is a wonderful publication, and it's downloadable and available at the Minnesota Fathers and Families Network, and that's at mnfathers.org. And if you look under the publications tab, it's called the Daddy Book, and it's specifically for dads who have, for their babies 0 to 1, and I believe they're working on a toddler version.
Okay.
But it's a really, I was just thinking when you said, you know, inviting the dads in, because so much of our stuff is geared to moms, this is specifically for dads, and it's very user-friendly. So there's a resource.
All right, so when we look at that developmental and trauma lens and apply that to those adolescent parents, getting to know how she thinks about and feels about things that can help us plan for those interventions. One of the things that I think is hard about this is we tend to apply our reality to all situations. I think it's human nature. And so when we look at this group of people and we're working with this group of people, without keeping all of the things that we discussed in mind, we tend to set goals and move ahead without that realistic picture of what can happen. And so I think that's helpful to keep in mind. What are the thinking processes that she uses to think about her life, including that future focus and present focus? We know the adolescents aren't set up to be good at that future focus. Although, when you ask teenage parents what they want for their kids, it's very similar to what we might say a typical parent would want for their kids. I find that fascinating, whether people have experienced trauma, whether they're teenage parents, poverty, you name it. Most parents will give you the same output. They want them to be successful in school. They want them to be productive people, those kinds of things. Also want to be thinking about mood state and mood today. Sometimes I think we feel like failures when we go into these home visits, and the mood for today isn't the one that we wish that it would have been.
That's happened to you?
It has happened to me. And so that's to the point when we say, well, you know, I have a meeting today, I may have to leave a few minutes early. The tendency is to want to say that because we feel anxious about that mood, but just recognizing that we have to put that lens on, that developmental lens in that particular case, or the trauma lens, and say, this is about today, and we all have permission. I sometimes will say to parents, you know, everybody gets a free pass at times to have that bad day. How do we be good enough parents in those moments? We talk about that. So just recognizing that.
Well, what I hear you saying too is imagine for some parents, not unique to adolescent parents, their experience with relationships. Maybe if I'm in a bad mood and I act out with you, then you will abandon me, you will reject me. And for you to have that sort of compassionate, sounds like a bad day, and I will be back, can be a very therapeutic experience for some of these young parents.
And that mood, exactly as you said, is sort of their protective factor or their defense to relationships aren't successful for me. So therefore I will protect myself, and that way you can go and it will all work out just as I expected. So that new experience can be very different for those teens. Their receptivity to intervention, how open are they to learning, and how guarded can they be? And this is a common one for teens. They are extremely guarded, and that is, I think, self-preservation. Most of the time, particularly when you look through the trauma lens. I need something, a maladaptive way even, to protect myself from how difficult and how hard this is as I guard.
And I know you're judging me because that's my life experience.
Yesterday when I was helping a mom get her little guy in the car after she gave us the rest of the story, we've been working together for about 6 months, and she gave us the rest of the story yesterday, which we've been waiting for. We knew there was the rest of the story, we just hadn't gotten it yet. So she gave me the rest of it, talked about what she was going to do, and talked about how upset she was because the first phone call she made was to her mom, and she said her mom just told her, well, get your act together, figure it out. And this has been her experience for a long period of time, and now as a teen parent living outside of that mother's home, she's trying to survive. And she said 2 things to me that were very powerful. One was, I am sick of people judging me for trying to survive.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, oh my, that is so powerful. And the other one was, when I called my mom, all I wanted was a cigarette and a hug. That's all I wanted from her. And I thought, really what you were saying was the hug, the connection. I need you to say, I can drive over here and give you something. A cigarette and a hug. And I thought, so before she left, I said, I'm going to ask permission, if I can, and you have the ability to say no, if you need a hug before you go. And there was 0 hesitation. And she said, yes, I do. Absolutely, I do.
Oh, nice.
And so it's so interesting thinking about, is this person receptive? This was 6 months in the making for her to even be receptive for that moment. And so when I struggle with, oh, are we making progress, I have to remind myself that these folks have to be open to that learning, and that will only happen through relationship. And so the patience has to prevail.
Yeah.
Which isn't always the case.
Holding the hope.
Holding the hope. Yes. Okay, so we have a couple of comments or questions here about that resource for the Daddy book. Can you repeat the website and source? And then another one, where did you say we could find it?
It's the Minnesota Fathers and Families Network. And I believe that the website is MN Fathers, so MNFATHERS.org. And then if you go to, I think they have a publications tab, go to that, and you can get the Daddy book.
All right. A couple of lovely questions when we look from that developmental and trauma lens, how this parent might be thinking, what can she tell me, what can you tell me about yourself? Helping them sort of activate that prefrontal cortex to do some thoughtful planning about what's going to be happening in those upcoming years. How has your life changed since you've become pregnant? It's so nice because I think it's a caring question. Sort of that idea of, wow, you really want to know? Because I've thought a lot about it, but you're asking, which is a nice connector. Those questions about what makes that good mother or father. A lot of times I'm surprised at what the answers are to that question about what do you think makes a good parent. A lot of these teens have, the ideas is in there. It's the practical piece that gets in the way, along with ACEs and lots of other things. What have you learned about your baby so far? So as we get down to that ending question, that helps give a slight opening to that lens of how is this for the baby, which is one of our goals.
It also encourages observation. And to me, I would look at that question and it implies that you know more about your baby than I do. And I love that.
Puts them in the expert role.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, we've mentioned a couple pieces about the relationship as we've moved through. But this is a piece that is, I think, central. It is central to the work of home visiting. We will make progress when we have relationships. That's just how it is. And that progress might be small. It might be really big gains. It all depends on the family you're working with. But without that relationship, I really think the ship is sunk.
Mm-hmm.
Because I am a fairly regulated adult, and when somebody tells me what to do, and I don't have a relationship with that person, it usually doesn't go well.
Good to know, Angie.
It is good to know. A little bit of feisty in there. But I think, you know, when we actually look at this, all of this information through our personal lens, it tells us this is true for all of us. So when we use that regulating partner idea with those parents, they have an experience that they can hopefully then pass on to their child.
Carol Siegel uses this lovely term, intentional hanging out.
Oh, I like that.
Which is really about engagement and building relationships. But sometimes I think we can go into those visits and feel like, what am I doing here? What have I accomplished? Well, sometimes it really is about that intentional hanging out. And sometimes you get some work done and then chaos occurs, and weeks later you have to default back to intentional hanging out and re-engage. But man,
I love that.
That's harder.
You know, I think the intentional hanging out produces fruit. It's just down the road.
Yep.
So you're it's almost like you're building this capacity to be able to have some of those really intentional, difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. I think it matters. I think that building of trust. And that's what happened yesterday as we walked out to the car. There was a point where she said, you guys have stuck around, and I feel like I owe you the rest of the story. And then we got the story, and she had already made some plans using her prefrontal cortex to help herself and her children. And then all I could say was, you have obviously the best interest of your children. And it was pretty powerful. So I think about that relationship. We never would have gotten there because she's a volatile person. There are triggers all over the place. And so it's really about that intention.
Oh, great example.
All right. So when we apply the developmental lens and client-centered principles, for example, knowing that autonomy is a major developmental task of adolescence, we might consider approaches that teach through discovery, acknowledge the parent's right to choose. You know, it's so interesting, as you talked earlier, Michele, about the developmental tasks of toddlers and teens. Mm-hmm. And this really supports that. I think we have to go back to that. You have some choices in this matter, and so you tell us how this is going to work best for you. And that discovery, that is, teens are ready to learn about new things and become experts in different areas. So I think if we look at that discovery piece, it feels lighter to me when I have those as an agenda item, as opposed to this family needs to figure out how to have a baby.
So we fine-tune our skill at asking open-ended questions for a lot of these, don't they?
Yeah.
I love this phrase. You could do that, but what do you think would happen? And I actually learned that from Gloria Ferguson, who did a lot of work with adolescent parents in St. Paul. You could do that, but how do you think that's going to go?
Yeah. So that was what David Walsh advised in the class about teens. He said, we function as that executive brain. So he said, if you can imagine, there's a huge detour sign in the front prefrontal cortex sticking out of this adolescent brain. That was the image that he used. And so he said, if there's a detour, where do they detour to? And so there has to be sort of the support or side road. He was using sort of that metaphor of construction, the side road that you can take. And we have to be the side road. So that you could do that, and that's that side road. I'm going to hold this for you for a second because you aren't able to do that right now. So we do that in the context of relationship.
Nice.
And the teen has the ability then to have a choice.
So rather than, if we continue the construction metaphor, rather than putting up a roadblock by telling them what to do,
yes.
we point out that we help them think through the detour.
Yes, exactly. What's the best route?
Yeah. That's lovely.
The challenge of keeping the baby in the lens. I love that it says easier said than done. I think a lot of times that many of us do that relationship piece well with the parents.
Mm-hmm.
And my training as a parent educator is a default to that. And I think in some ways it comes in handy, and in other ways it's debilitating, because keeping that lens of the baby front and center and helping that parent see that that is a piece that has to be attended to can be very difficult. A lot of these teams will tell you stories for hours about the drama and who's involved in what. And I've seen pictures and text of strings of things that have, you need to see this. You need to, listen to my story, listen to my story. And the whole time they're becoming agitated, the baby's becoming agitated, and I'm becoming uncomfortable. And so I think keeping that lens of the baby and wondering, I wonder what this experience is. The story you're telling me, these texts you're showing me, your baby's real long. For them to go pick someone up in the Twin Cities at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Or even just making those observations. I can tell that you're really, this was really upsetting for you, but I'm noticing that as you're telling me the story, the baby's getting fussier. What do you think that's about? And trying to connect the dots.
Yeah. That side road. Pulling that conversation back to the baby. I think that's always our goal. And I think this happens in parent groups as well. We have to bring that. Whenever we get stuck and the conversation goes awry, we have to think about, all right, let's bring this back to the children that were here. Right. As you said, that was life for the baby.
Well, and what are some strategies that come to mind for you when you think about not getting on that roller coaster with the adolescent? I don't know, I think of things like, it sounds like this is really important to you. Let's take about 15 minutes and talk about it, and then let's get back to the baby. Or how do you contain that to keep the baby in the lens? I think that's the easier said than done thing.
I think so, and I think one of our best strategies is, as you just described, I think when we say to parents, let's talk about this for a couple of minutes, and then what I'm noticing is, or have you noticed the reaction of the toddler who just cranked it up and is now standing on the TV stand, which was an experience a few weeks ago, or the baby's crying.
Right.
And so I'm noticing this is affecting the room. And so I really want us to, and there's been times I've said, well, let's set up an alternative time when you have a few minutes, a 10-minute time block where we can talk that doesn't affect the baby, which teaches them a strategy.
Right.
And
a boundary around the baby. And babies are listening, and that's very rich opportunity.
I think we've talked quite a bit about that importance of engaging dads. There's no such thing as a fatherless child. One of the things I think about in terms of dads, my sister-in-law worked at a pregnancy crisis center for a number of years. And she said the interesting part of that work is saw a number of teens, many of the clients were teens, and many of them talked about something related to their dad. There was some piece that correlated with, my dad's never been around, my dad was abusive, whatever the case might be. And I always think about that when I think about quotes like, there's no such thing as a fatherless child, and how much those kids need that. And if those kids are now teenagers and have that experience, how does that play into the complexity of this particular family?
And because children always wonder, if they've never known their dad, they always wonder. They have a fantasy dad. They have, it's just part of the human condition, I think. So how do we meet that need?
I agree. Another challenge for our dads is this idea of that gatekeeping effect. And so if mom is going to be in control and in charge of all aspects of this child's life, And we are no longer together as a couple in particular. That's another challenge. I'm going to control that gate. And what are you going to do about it?
Yep.
And so helping parents, particularly the adolescent population of females, that these dads, here's what's important about the dads. I understand your relationship is taxed in these ways, but let's figure out for your baby what might be helpful. So it's certainly true. Fathers interact, dads interact differently than mothers, and so there's lots of good information about the play in particular and how those dads get that kind of rough and tumble and what's good about that and why kids need both moms and dads. The adolescent, I think their brains would suggest that if they need their dads, then I'm no longer important. So that's part of that gatekeeping being reinforced and helping families see that children benefit from having them.
And I think that there's research that shows that fathers in general tend to be more comfortable with their children when they become toddlers, and they can do that roughhousing play. And so if we eliminate that teen dad at the beginning, when most fathers, certainly not all, but many fathers feel less adequate caring for infants, then we're cheating both of them out of that opportunity.
The father, oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. And then we have, I love the major mom, grandma. And we, in so many of the visits that I have done for teens, I would say probably 80% of those would be a grandma, mom, baby situation, grandma, mom, toddler. It's an interesting group. A number of studies suggest that teen mothers living in multi-generational homes is associated with less responsive parenting by both mother and grandmother. In my observation, the potential reason for this is because mother and grandmother still have some unfinished business. And so there is some focus on grandmother wanting mom to be responsible, mom saying grandmother's being overpowering. So there's all of these different dynamics that happen in that relationship, which affect the baby or toddler in the home. But there's less ability to be responsive to the parenting of that child because there's so much unfinished business. There was one house I went into a couple years ago, and the teenage mom, grandmother actually had parental rights. So that's always an interesting scenario. A lot of these teens, there are some teens that have given up their parental rights to grandma for a variety of reasons. Could be the abuse of drugs, could be the abuse of alcohol, could be overwhelmed, they need to take off for a while, I come back. And now when they're back in this situation, which is true for this home visit that I was on, grandma's saying, well, I don't know if you're responsible yet. I'll sign that paperwork when I think you've done X, Y, Z. So grandma's kind of dangling the guardian paperwork over the head of this teen. And this teen was I think she operated out of her amygdala 90% of the time. Right? So angry, so frustrated. And one day I asked her in this session, because grandma was kind of harping on her, and I said to the mom, I have a question for you, and I really hope that this is an okay question to ask. I'm kind of nervous about asking because I don't want to be offensive, and I know how you want to be respected, and is it okay for me to ask? Like, yeah, what is it? You can have that kind of whatever. And I said, I'm curious. Your mom is telling me you're defensive all the time. I don't see that every time I come here. I see parts of that, but I don't see all of that. She said, okay. And she kind of softened a little bit. And I said, I do see these things out of you. And, she kind of softened a little bit more. And then I thought, okay, I don't ask, no, I'm never going to ask. And I said, what happens to you if you're not defensive? What's your alternative strategy? And she looked at me, which felt like forever, and said, I don't have one.
Oh.
And she started to cry.
Oh.
And so.
And grandma was there hearing this.
There.
Wow.
And I said, okay, I was wondering, because I can't imagine how hard it must be to be on the defense all the time, wondering if people are going to accept you, wondering what people are going to say about you, judge you, all of those things. And I just was wondering if that's a heavy burden to carry. And she couldn't respond. And Grandma was standing there with her jaw on the floor saying, okay. And then we had some space to talk about it, which was a lovely opportunity. I didn't know if I would, I didn't, honestly, I was just, I have to be honest and say I was kind of curious, which is why I asked the question. Because I thought, what do you do? Do you do this all day long? Because this is going to be tiring. So I think we have to recognize why there's a struggle to be responsive. And there's all of this competing for judgment and mom's eyes. And what kid doesn't want to make their parents proud?
Yeah.
You know, it's like just acknowledge that I'm worth something. And so, I don't know, it's powerful.
I love how you framed that, though, Angie, because the way you describe it, you ask permission to ask the question, and you set it up so that I'm worried that I might offend you. So you need to let me know if I do offend you. So again, you're keeping the ball in her lap. She has control over this conversation, the way you framed the question. I love that. I think that must have been really helpful.
You know, and it was interesting when you think about that relationship part, I think that might have been the turning point. So she started to show up more frequently to the visits. It wasn't just Grandma. And so I think we can't underestimate that power that we have to build that trust.
But how long it can take
How
to get there, as
long
you
it
say.
can take, absolutely.
Right. And I think there's another competing developmental agenda here in a way, because I think research tells us that adolescent parents who live with their parents are more likely to graduate from high school. And yet, then the downside is you get this ambiguity about who's the mom of this baby from the baby's perspective, because Grandma alternates, I would think, often between this is your baby, you take care of the baby, and I can't stand the way you're taking care or not taking care of the baby, so I'm going to take care of the baby, or I will take care of the baby so you can do your homework. So it just sounds like it would be a very challenging dynamic under the best of circumstances.
Micromanaged is what I observe. So people are just constantly being micromanaged, and the teens don't like that. Even if you're a typical teen, you're not going to appreciate that.
No, probably not.
So you're right. There's lots of competing. And finding that balance as a home visitor between working with that teen parent while also supporting Grandma's role. And so you're sort of, I always think of that container idea and how you're holding those in the room. You've got the baby in there, and you've got the Grandma in there, and you've got the mom in there. And sometimes you feel like you can use it. There's a lot going on.
Absolutely.
So possibilities for growth and change. We just really want to work on that, building that better baby, giving that baby opportunities to have that responsive care helps that baby's cues be easier to read. And if you have no experience in this, you haven't experienced it from your caregiver, it makes challenging to do. But when this process goes well, you come back and parents say, oh, I noticed.
Right.
They did this and I saw that, and how exciting that is for them to feel that response from that baby.
Can I insert a commercial here?
Yeah.
So the program I referenced earlier that I worked for, where there were a lot of adolescent parents, and it had to do with the babies being in child care, and I know a lot of adolescent programs have the child care on site. And I just don't think we can overestimate the impact that child care providers can have on this part when they are well supported and intentional about it. So that if my baby's in child care and being responded to in a consistent, predictable way much of the day, that baby's cues are going to be clearer. And that's going to, as an adolescent parent, I'm going to feel more successful in reading those cues. So I think, child care, when it's high quality and well done, and done with an emphasis on partnering with the adolescent parent as well, just has such potential to contribute to this. So that's my plug for high quality child care and supporting those caregivers in their efforts to support adolescent parents, because it takes a village.
It does. And it matters, and it works.
It really does.
When we do that work well. Parent-caregiver behavior, increased sensitivity and responsive to the infant needs. When they have different experiences with relationships with their home visitors, they have an idea of what that can look like.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes that's the good work that we do on a daily basis.
So we have 4 basic goals of teen-parent work. This is oversimplified, Angie, and feel free to help me nuance this.
All right.
But I think if we think about how can we help the adolescent parent, and again, first and foremost, as Angie, you said clearly, it really, this is based on a foundation of relationship. And that happens, can happen simultaneously, but none of these goals will be effective without that relationship. But how do we help this teen learn to identify, recognize the baby's signals, and then respond? Given their developmental status, how can we be helpful? So I like this list of what does the parent need to know first, and we've alluded to these. That babies actually do have thoughts and feelings and intentions that are different from ours. So when you're playing with that baby and you're tickling and that baby turns away, baby's not rejecting you, but baby needs a break. And because of the baby's own unique response to this game. And then connecting the dots, I think in terms of when we add ACEs into the equation for adolescent parents, a lot of adolescent parents don't know how they feel, much less how their baby feels, and how to connect the dots. So I'm just pissed, I'm in a bad mood. Tell me about why you're in a bad mood. I'm just in a bad mood, as opposed to, I wonder if you're feeling down because you were hoping to go out last night and you didn't get to. And that they often don't have that connection between circumstances and the emotions that get evoked. And now we're asking them to do that for their babies. So the idea that, I wonder if why do you think he's crying? What do you think that's about? I wonder if he's hungry. I wonder if he just needs comfort. But helping them connect those dots. And knowing that babies aren't very good at giving clear cues. Of course you don't understand what he wants. Most parents don't when babies are little. It's a learning, you are learning about each other. So that kind of reassurance that, but all my guesses about what my baby needs are going to be strengthening your baby's cues. It's going to get easier as we go along. And then this, again, promoting reflective functioning and helping them see the baby's perspective, which we talked about. What do you think it's like for your baby when? This idea that we want teens to form realistic expectations and attitudes based on how they understand themselves and others, especially their child. So it's like I'm going to go to, having a baby isn't going to change anything. I'm going to be able to do what I've always done. And how do we help them have more realistic expectations so that when they're disappointed in themselves or their ability to achieve the goals they have, it doesn't become an issue that it makes the more tension in the relationship between themselves and the baby. So realistic expectations for themselves as well as for their babies. And then I think you've given us some really lovely examples about helping that mom discover the angels in the nursery, that there were things that happened in her earlier childhood that help us understand why she has such drive and why she wants to be a good parent. But also the ghosts in the nursery. Do you remember a time when you got hurt and somebody comforted you? Really? You would get in trouble if you cried when you were hurt? What was that like for you? And what would you like that to be like for your baby? So taking it back to that empowerment of, wow, and reflecting, and they can say, well, it was no big deal. I turned out fine. But still being able to hold, as the home visitor, holding up that mirror that says, well, yeah, but from when you tell me that, I feel sad for you. How would you like it to be for your baby? Again, you can choose what you're going to take forward. The good stuff that you experienced, How do you want to move that forward, and how do you want to leave the bad stuff behind and do it differently for your baby? And then, again, just if we don't accomplish anything else in home visiting, if we can give our clients the sense that it is possible to have a different kind of relationship than I may have had in the past. There are people out there who can be predictable and consistent. And so if I've had that experience once, I'll be that much more open to the possibility that I might be able to get support from a teacher or somebody else who comes along in my life, which for many of our clients is a huge accomplishment. Oh, and then this building reflective capacity, as I think we've been talking about, which is challenging for teens. This idea that we can hold you in your mind, I hold you in my mind even when we're not together. And I think we cannot underestimate the power of those words, I've been thinking about you. That, because in the end, that's exactly what we want a parent to do for her child. We want her to think about the baby when she's not with the baby. We want her to be able to take the baby's perspective. And so to give them the experience, if I've been thinking about you, I was wondering about how that went, can be just a powerful experience for many of these parents. And then this promoting the baby as a unique person. You know, even when we are lucky enough to be able to engage adolescents during pregnancy before the birth of their child, which, as you know, Daniel Stern talks about that motherhood constellation, that's just such a window of opportunity. But that, you know, talking to the pregnant belly, hi Maya's baby, and then talking for the baby when you want to say something that might be challenging. Mom, pick me up, I missed you. Rather than, I think you should pick up your baby. Right. Can be useful. And we talked about that. We can only teach about relationships with relationships. So I love this quote, do unto others as you would have others do unto others. And research tells us that the quality of the relationship between the home visitor and the mom can influence the relationship between the mom and the baby. So that parallel process is just such a lovely concept. That we're going to want to draw on what the parent knows and feels. Again, it's that helping the parent, the adolescent parent, respecting her, striving for autonomy, and using inquiry rather than telling them what to do. And then acknowledging that, back to that, acknowledging the parent's right to choose. So again, always keeping that we have two developmental agendas that we need to hold in this work. The teenager's developmental agenda as well as the baby's adolescent, or the baby's developmental agenda. And I think I did my commercial here on the potential of childcare to be a real asset. And let us not forget birth control. That we know that postponing a next pregnancy is a huge predictor of positive outcomes for both the child and the parent. So I think, you know, we sometimes worry about what's my role with this parent and is it my place to ask about birth control. But I think there are ways to do that, or make sure that somebody on that team is doing that. Because, you know, again, knowing what we know about the adolescent brain, we can't assume anything. And part of the way we do that is to celebrate this baby and the importance of the parent for this baby, so that I don't need to have another baby right away because I'm so invested in making sure this baby has positive developmental outcomes. So we're coming to the end of our time together, but we did just throw in this perspective pyramid, which I know many of you are familiar with, but just as a way when we feel stuck with a particular family situation, to just do this, taking the perspectives of each. What's it like to be this mom, this child, this grandma, this dad? What's it like to be me in this situation? Because that gives us a lot of information. So, you know, thinking through those questions. And if anyone's interested, you could play with this scenario and give that some thought as well. But finally, the need for self-care. Angie, would you say this is challenging work?
I would say this is challenging work. We just took Monday this week to go to a conference solely focused on self-care.
Wow.
For providers. And I would say the majority of the room was home visitors from different agencies.
Mm-hmm.
But this full day of how do we biologically and emotionally respond to this work,
mm-hmm.
and how do we calm that through a variety of different ways and thoughts and activities. You know, the appreciation, it's almost like raising kids sometimes. I think it parallels. They don't just turn around and say, oh, you know what, thanks for setting that limit for me. I'm so glad you said that I need to be home by this time and keeping me safe. You know, all of that stuff just doesn't happen with teens. Nor does it happen in our home visit family.
Mm-mm.
You know, you have to learn to read the cues, mm-hmm. right, of kids yep. and of our families to know that this work is making a difference. There's an appreciation for it, but you have to know what you're looking for. And so I think there are lots and lots of self-care pieces that are helpful, and that reflective supervision, just doing that work, being in groups myself and starting to do that work with others has been so helpful. We need places to talk about the complexity of this work and how it affects us internally.
Absolutely.
So that we can go back and do it in a way that's healthy and helpful for mm-hmm. families and for ourselves.
Yep, absolutely. Are there any other questions that people are asking?
There was just one about the dialogue to the webinar. Will that be available to listen to, which Michael responded to?
Yes, good.
It will be at the Targeted Home Visiting Minnesota.org, and he's got the website on there. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for your participation, and we really appreciate it. And thank you, Angie, for sharing your experience as part of this as well.
Thank you for joining. Very much appreciated.
Yes. So go forth